So we're going to start with, I have a question for Jim in order to sort of lay out some of the groundwork for the discussion. Jim, so you've done a lot of work on institutionalizing deliberation, which implies that it doesn't happen by itself. If you need to work on institutionalizing it, then it's not happening by itself. So can you tell us about the work you've done and the reasons why it doesn't happen and what you have to do in order to make it happen?
Well, there's several limitations of public opinion as we normally find it in natural settings. Most people are not well informed about complicated public policy issues. Why should they be? Anthony Downs years ago coined a term, rational ignorance, for this phenomenon. If I have one vote in millions, why should I pay a lot of attention to the details of even something as important as a healthcare reform or a change in the pension system or the Social Security system? Any complicated issue. I've got other things to do. I've got to live my life, provide for my family, keep my job, that sort of thing. And individually, I will not have much effect. So low levels of information for most of the mass public. Secondly, a lot of the opinions reported in polls, even if you take polls, which are representative, unlike a lot of other consultations, those opinions don't exist because people never like to say they don't know. So just as people responded to the famous Public Affairs Act of 1975 with responses, the Public Affairs Act of 1975 was fictional. Nobody wanted to admit they didn't know what it meant, so they would offer answers. Some of the opinions reported in polls are like that. They're non-attitudes or phantom opinions. Thirdly, people, if they do talk about politics or policy, tend to talk to people like themselves. And if you know someone with whom you strongly disagree, it's a lot easier to talk about the weather than to talk about serious issues. So you need to create a safe public space where people are not going to insult each other and they're actually going to think together. They're going to listen to each other. I mean, the title of this panel is Government as If Listening Mattered. It's the people listening to each other. It's government listening to the people so that the people think their voice matters. And it's the people thinking that government will listen reciprocally so that they will think it's worth the effort. But even then, there's this collective action problem of each person only has one vote in millions. So we create an institutional design where each person really thinks his or her voice matters because we take scientific samples where each person has a big piece of the action, but they're still representative. And this allows us to get over the problem of self-selected consultation, which has become rampant on the internet, which is useful for some purposes, but leads to absurdities, like the Republicans having the problem of the notion of turning over the nation's defense relying on the dark nights of Monty Python, which was reviewed, just taken off the website this morning in a mass consultation, because the natural thing to do if you're going to consult the public is just to ask them. But then the question is, who do you ask? If you ask anybody who selects themselves, you get self-organized intense interests or maybe mischievous efforts like you get misleading. You don't get something that's representative of opinion. So if you use the science of public opinion research to get something that's representative, but then you use the process of deliberation to move beyond, you can get the opinions of people before and after they deliberate. And what we have found in online projects and in face-to-face projects in 16 countries, we do this, make the informed and representative views of the public and input to the policy process. We find, surprisingly, not surprisingly to me, but surprisingly to some of the critics of deliberation, that the people in aggregate are pretty smart. It's just most of the time they don't pay attention because they don't think their voice matters. But actually consulting the public in aggregate in a representative and thoughtful way provides an input to public policy making. We brought, if you look in my book, When the People Speak, which is out there, we brought wind power to Texas, where wind power was the last. Texas was last in wind power when we started, and it's now first. We solved budget crises in Rome and other places, more ethnic mutual understanding, in clean water in a part of China.
Can you give us an example of how this actually works?
Okay.
So what would you
in those Texas examples, the utilities were supposed to consult the public. They said, how do we consult the public? If we have open meetings, we get organized interests and lobbyists. If we do focus groups, they're too small to be representative. If we do polls, the public doesn't have any information. In fact, Phil Converse discovered the non-attitudes or phantom opinions with a question about electric utilities. Public doesn't have the information. So then they did deliberative polls where we had all the stakeholder groups who came together, environmental groups, consumer groups, advocates of alternative energy, the big customers. They agreed on what any citizen should know. In fact, any resident should know, because non-citizens use electricity too. Anybody in the state should know about the alternative energy choices: coal, natural gas, demand-side management, cutting the need, conservation, wind power, renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera.
And it's really important here, just to underscore, that these groups beforehand agreed on the materials that were going to go to the deliberative poll. Because if those materials aren't balanced and fair and agreed upon to begin with, the whole process is corrupt. Just wanted to underscore that for the
Absolutely. So that's the first step. What is a basis for discussion? And they fight, you know. We did a referendum in Australia and the Republic where the national referendum, where the briefing document went through 19 complete drafts till they finally agreed. I was commuting to Australia. I almost killed myself going back and forth. It was incredible. But the point is that you get an agreed basis for discussion. They don't have to agree about what should be done, but what are reasonable arguments on either side. So you have that. Then you can construct a very detailed survey, not only about what should be done, but lots of explanatory variables so you can understand how and why people are changing, and information questions so you can show that people are becoming more informed in the process. Then you put them through a process of deliberation, and as I say, with small group moderated discussions, questions to competing experts. We have an online version, which we've been doing with PBS's By the People and YouGov Polymetrics. We have a face-to-face version, which we do for any scale. And one of the reasons why I believe the internet can really solve the problems of democracy is when I did the first face-to-face national deliberative poll, I had to get American Airlines to be the official airline so we could get affordable tickets. But if we do it online, I don't need an airline. I don't need hotels. It's a lot more cost-effective. It cuts the cost 90%.
Just a clarification question. You're getting some people into a room, a virtual or a real room?
Yeah, 500 people.
Oh, 500 people.
400, 500 people.
And these are people who have been chosen to be representative according to your polling
in
data.
attitudes and demographics.
Okay.
So it's not just a few demographic screens, but because we do the survey before we recruit, we can show these people are attitudinally representative. So you don't just get the people who feel intensely about something. You get the broad swath of public opinion and very few statistically significant differences between participants and non-participants.
Has everybody got that these people are drawn by lot? So in China, for example, they had a big glass urn with ping pong balls with numbers in it. And you picked one out and it said 2, and then another 4, and then another 7, another 6, and then Mr. 2476 was the person selected. So we, you know, in the United States, we use computers and the public accepts that, but in China, everybody was pretty sure that it was going to be fixed if the government did it, so they did it with a big urn. I just wanted to kind of make sure everybody gets that this is done by a random selection.
By random sampling, and then, but I thought I invented it, but then it turns out to go back to ancient Athens where they had a machine.
You invented it.
What?
You didn't know about, you were trying to tell us you didn't know about Greece before?
I thought I invented deliberative polling, but I didn't. It was the ancient Athenians selected the Council of 500 by lot, and I visited the machine, which you can see in the Forum of Ancient Athens. It's a machine called the Klerotarion, which you can look up online, K-L-E-R-O-T-E-R. It's a machine, it looks like a bingo machine, and they use that to select randomly the people who would be the Council of 500.
Property-owning white men.
Well, yes, among the citizens, right. But the point is it was a form of democracy that flourished 2,400 years ago. And in fact, as Jane knows, in my book I described from Athens to Athens, because we brought it back to Athens. We got Papandreou to do deliberative polling to select candidates as opposed to a primary.
So I want to be more step by step here. We
have
got 500 people in a room. We've got briefing books. Everybody's agreed upon are the essential materials. They've been chosen by lot, so they're representative. They talk for how long and in what format?
Well, at least one day, maybe 2 or 3 days. And in the online one, we have bi-weekly 2-hour sessions that go for a bunch of weeks. But the essential element is the moderated small group discussion, so people don't flame at each other, insult each other. They listen to each other, and they come up with key questions which panels of competing experts answer from different points of view. So it's the people's agenda of questions that get answered. And then we show, then at the end they take the same survey as on first contact, so we can show that the opinions change from top-of-the-head opinions to considered judgments. We can show that people are more informed, and we also can identify the levers of public opinion. We see why people move the way they do. What are their key concerns? Why do they come out this way rather than that? And so that becomes, you get a nuanced, fairly detailed picture of what public opinion would be like if everybody were really engaged in the issue, got their questions answered, and became more informed. And that can become an input to policy. It can be a basis for responsible advocacy. That is, it can be a basis for what would, so much of, I like to say our political system has moved from Madison to Madison Avenue. Right now, we started with a view of deliberation by representatives, and we've moved to selling and manipulating public opinion about policy the way we sell soap or automobiles. And if we can then thoughtfully empower the public rather than manipulate the public, instead of the strategically incomplete half-truths that are the, usually not pure falsehood, half-truths, the strategically incomplete half-truths that are the coin of the realm in persuasion, in the persuasion industry, we can have a public consultation process that empowers the public with these kinds of results. Okay. And so that's the basic picture. If you go to the Center for Deliberative Democracy website, you'll see that it works all over the world in virtual space across languages. We did it for the entire European Union in the Parliament building with 21 languages. The Irish wanted to speak English. But we also did with ethnic conflict, Northern Ireland, Bulgaria and the Roma. It works under China. It works under conditions where you wouldn't believe it would work. And so, but it only works then for the microcosm, but then it can be useful for the policymakers and the public dialogue.
Great. So you have a methodology that addresses several problems simultaneously. It's deliberative. It has the circumstances set up for deliberation. It is representative, and you're tracking the changes, and it's based upon an agreed upon set of materials, and it can be then used by policymakers, among others, to have a sense of what a deliberative result would be from the populace. So I want to ask, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
That's excellent.
So I want to ask Jane to respond. I'm going to just guess that you think this is a good idea, but is it enough of a good idea?
You can tell from the smile on my face, I think it's a good idea. I think we're living in an arms race. In the United States, our politics is getting more and more polarized every day for several irreversible reasons. So as those reasons persist and our politics becomes more and more polarized, we have to invent technologies that'll weigh in on the other side. We have to think of ways to encourage people to listen to one another. And that's going to be very, very hard to match the increasing rate of polarization with a comparable increase in our capacity for mutual listening. So that's why I'm just crazy about these deliberative polls, because I think they do, in fact, I've watched them work, I've read a number of the results. I think they do, in fact, get ordinary people, a random sample, poor people, rich people, welfare recipients, capitalists, et cetera, in a room together, and they do listen to one another, and they do come out with sensible suggestions, which then governments, like the Texas utilities, can implement. And when they're challenged, they can say, look, a representative body of the citizens thought about this a lot and made these recommendations. So this is really terrific. It's got a couple of problems. One is cost. The cost is quite huge. If you think, even if you do it on the internet, it's very difficult to get a random sample or anything close to a random sample because there's always the holdouts. There's always the poor person who doesn't feel that they really want to go in front of all those other people and make a fool of themselves. There's the kid who's, sitting and smoking dope in a jacuzzi, whatever, doesn't want to have anything to do with it. There's a whole ton of people. There's somebody who aren't going to come. And to try to get them to come, to try to create the inducement so that you get a really random sample, is expensive. And even if you do it on the internet, still got to get people there. The second huge cost is moderation. Even, again, you have to get good facilitators because you've got to have people saying, so-and-so, you haven't spoken yet. Give us your opinion on that. You've got to keep people from dumping on one another because there's a huge fear of conflict among many members of the American public and Danes and Indians and Chinese too. I mean, there's just lots of people who are afraid of being burned if they're in a small group and they're made to look stupid or they're attacked. So you've got to have a moderator who creates a really safe space. Those moderators cost money. So how are you going to really get this to touch large numbers of people? That's a question that you guys are going to have to answer. That's a question that people who are thinking about technology have to really ask themselves. You could try to get it to pay its own way. You could have something on the internet where you had to kind of pay to get in, and that payment would pay for the facilitators and so forth. But it's primarily the middle class people who are going to do that. So how are you going to make this work? Is it going to rely on foundations for the rest of its life? That's what Jim's work has been funded a lot by foundations, sometimes by the media. You know, foundations, they don't fund things after the first startup, after the first seed money, after it's no longer a catchword. So if this is going to really become part of our lives, if this idea, this Athenian idea of bringing citizens together who are chosen randomly as a microcosm of the polity to talk about these important questions and then taking their answers seriously, if that's going to actually become part of a working democracy that fights the polarization, somehow or other, it's got to be paid for. And the second, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, the second thing is a scale. You know, taking it. That question you were going to ask, yeah. You know, taking it to scale. That's connected with this cost stuff. So,
Go
ahead.
If everybody in America understood this right now, I'm only semi-joking by saying, heck with foundations, let's get BP to pay for it. But yeah. the point is, a lot of things are done by sponsorship in the U.S., and that might be a way to do it. I think it's important to think about what the problems are between here and there. Jim hasn't mentioned it yet, but one of the things in his book is an idea that we should have a deliberation day before elections. We should have an entire day in which everybody goes through this very carefully thought out process whereby information is provided. And it's interesting to me the parallels with the neutral point of view that Wikipedia uses. There's no sense trying to do something on Wikipedia without taking into account the people who disagree with you. Otherwise, they'll just edit what you have to say. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is a very similar process in providing this information. However, we're going to get to this notion of deliberation day and whether the internet has a role to play in it. I just wonder about the role of deliberation in our culture or listening in our culture. It's, I think, an idea that needs to be discussed before it can be, the problems that Jane points out can be approached or solved.
Deliberation Day is something that Jim and Bruce Ackerman at Yale came up with. The idea is that at Election Day, you declare it a holiday, which is what anybody who cares about participatory democracy has been trying to have happen for years and years and years and years, make Election Day a holiday. But then you also bring people together from neighborhoods and you pay them, just the way the Athenian juries were paid to attend. You pay people to attend a deliberation in their neighborhoods with their neighbors. It's hugely expensive. How much did it cost? What was your?
It was billions.
Yeah, billions.
It makes the deliberative poll look cheap, by the way.
Yeah, really. So A, it costs billions. But B, as Cass Sunstein pointed out in a critique, it brings together neighborhoods. One of the beauties of deliberative polling is you take a sample, a random sample, and you're likely to get both sides, or if there are 3 sides, 4 sides, you're likely to get all those sides in the room. If you bring neighborhoods together, you know, people have been moving more closer and closer to one another politically. So the index of residential segregation by politics has been rising and rising and rising. People are moving much more in the United States because of lifestyle. They want to be close to people who groove like them. And the result of that is that political enclaves are getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And so that when you bring neighborhoods together, you're bringing like-minded political people together. And so Cass Sunstein did this deliberation day in Boulder and Colorado Springs. And he found that the Boulder people, who are kind of liberal and hip, got more liberal at the end of the deliberation day, and the Colorado people, who are pretty right-wing and
Probably a lot of people
they got more right-wing.
Are familiar with Cass Sunstein's doubts about the role of the internet in democracy, but for those who are not already familiar with that, his doubts, which I have grown more and more sympathetic with over time, are that the internet gives us many, many more choices of information, which a lot of people, including myself, believe is a good thing. And with those choices of information, it gives us the opportunity to select those we agree with, and there's a fair amount of evidence that people do that, and that would lead to more and more polarization. And I think I wouldn't want to stake much on the argument that the American electorate is becoming less polarized since the internet has become a big part of our lives. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to tease out causative factors, but I'm wondering about a medium that is still young, whether this notion of bringing people together across all kinds of divides might be healthy in itself, whatever the result is, that this would be an opportunity.
First, in my book, When the People Speak, I summarize the data of our studies, which Cass Sunstein has admitted and indeed granted in print, that in the deliberative poll, at least, there is no pattern of what he calls polarization. He finds it in jury-like processes, but it does not occur in the deliberative poll because the mechanisms of polarization, in his view, are the imbalance in the argument pool and a social comparison effect. We don't have that imbalance because we have all these elements of balance with the competing arguments, with a random sample randomly assigned, and moderation and balanced experts. And we don't have the social comparison effect because we get the results in confidential questionnaires. Now, what would happen with deliberation day as an open question? Since it costs billions of dollars, nobody's ever done it. And besides, his little experiment was only a few minutes long, not a whole day. However, what we would try to do is within geographical districts randomly assigned, so there would be some socioeconomic diversity, and probably on balance, aggregatively, it would balance out, but who knows? It would be worth experimenting with. I'm not here to argue for deliberation day directly, although I think it would be a good idea and would be worth experimentation at the local or regional level and worth study. I am here to advocate forthrightly deliberative polling online and face-to-face in both versions, depending on the context. If it's a national poll, online is very cost-effective. If it's in a town, face-to-face is very cost-effective. You don't need to do it online. I also think there might be ways of scaling up the deliberative process, because if you have a microcosm of the people, and you have a microcosm of all the arguments, and you have a day or two or three of discussions, you have a microcosm of all the considerations that are likely to come up. You could model that and provide a process which individuals could then go through themselves with online and then come to their own conclusions, comparing their results. And then you could, if you weighted the results in terms of who had done this, you could have a scalable deliberative poll process for the whole country for anybody who wanted it. One of the things we found is, it reminds me of that ad, try it and you'll like it, or whatever the catchphrase. Notice how advertising influences everything. Well, when people try the deliberative poll or the deliberative process, they love it. People then write us and call me up and say, how can I do another one? And I say, well, you have to be randomly chosen. I don't have any way for you to do another one. But if we had further opportunities for this to spread, or an online process that modeled the deliberative process, that would be a way of allowing people to come to terms with competing arguments. I just want to say about Sunstein's the argument that both Howard and Jenny mentioned is the dark side of our theory of liberty. John Stuart Mill said that liberty would foster diversity, diversity would foster individuality, which is what he meant really for the notion of autonomy or people thinking for themselves. Suppose that liberty fosters the choice not of diversity but sameness. Then instead of individuality, you get the like-minded talking to each other. And so people now have unprecedented degrees of liberty in terms of what they can expose themselves to, where they can live, all the things that they can do. So we have to foster a taste for people listening to the other side, for people opening up to different points of view. We should do that in the schools. We should do that to reach the whole mass population. Indeed, we've experimented in the schools. But that sort of thing, we should figure out a way. That's the ultimate way over the long term of spreading this. If we don't, we're going to get a society of increasingly hyperpolarization.
Okay.
As the unexpected result of something good, which is our liberty and the technology which gives us more choices.
So I want to ask a question about that, going all the way back to Jane's comment about cost and scale. The cost and scale is for doing deliberation using your carefully worked out methodology, which we know from example seems to work really well, but it's expensive. Since we actually seem not to like deliberating, or we would be doing it, one of the ways of scaling this is perhaps not only to scale your methodology, but to look for ways in which online communities in which, for example, Howard Rheingold is something of a well-known expert, ways in which outside of this methodology we can encourage the sort of interaction among people who disagree, which may be deliberative or maybe some other form of interaction, but interaction among people who disagree. What if anything, can be done to take online communities as they exist roughly in order to try to achieve some of the aims that Jim is achieving?
Well, I'll have to say that if you look at the development of political discourse among citizens since the days I was initially enthusiastic about it in the 1980s, it would be very difficult to make an argument that it has improved. Well, you can actually make an argument either way, and it's an exercise I do with my students, is take 15 minutes, just 15 minutes, and you can actually make a case that there is hope for the public sphere to be found in political discussions online. And I'd say it only takes about 30 seconds to make the case that we're really deteriorating to the point of almost self-destruction in terms of political discourse online. But in my experience, and I think this resonates a little bit with your methodology here, is the presence of a moderator, whether the moderator does anything or not, seems to eliminate about 99% of the noise. So
just having a moderator, even if the moderator never moderates.
If you've ever had a moderated news group, you know that you rarely have to turn down a posting. People just don't send you postings because it's futile. In my experience, I have started online communities of fairly large scale in which there were no rules and things deteriorated as you might expect. And I've had online communities in which there were no rules, but you had to email somebody and say why you wanted to join. In that case, 99.99% of the trolls go elsewhere. There are plenty of places to go make trouble. Why bother? So I think that, this is just a personal observation, but I think that any moderation at all does a great deal. A little bit of skilled facilitation probably goes a long way. Certainly, I think you can make the strong argument that people do like to argue online. Can those arguments become more deliberative and less shouting at each other, I think is the big question about the public sphere and the internet.
So let me ask a question I'm going to regret asking. this all assumes that deliberation is not only the good way, but the best way in order to achieve, I'm not sure what, so I'll leave that blank, but to achieve something that we all want. I'm not exactly sure what that is.
Good policy choices?
For example. That's, of course, good policy choices are not the only thing
Definitely
that we want
not.
from
Educated citizens.
and participatory citizens, citizens who feel that they're being listened to, which would, if we could get everywhere with 500 representatives and no participation, many of us, from anybody else, many of us would feel that that's good, but not, we still want people to have some sense of participation. There's also been arguments that deliberation, as it's normally construed, is a highly rational process that comes out of a cultural history that prefers reason to emotion, that thinks that commitment and interest are bad things that need to be held in suspension in order to reach results, that there's a feminist critique of it. Are we happy with the term and idea of deliberation?
Well, I am, but let me, obviously, but let me say, if you have a democracy, most theories of democracy would say you have to listen to the people in some way. So, do you want to listen to the people when they're thinking or when they're not thinking? I think when they're thinking. Normally, we listen to the people when they're not thinking or only when some of them are motivated to speak. So it's either unrepresentative or unthoughtful. Can we get thoughtful and representative? Now, what is thoughtful? Some people have observed my deliberative polls and said, well, wait a minute. This isn't really deliberation. These people are telling stories. And I say, ordinary people, when they reason about policy, they do tell stories. If you're talking about healthcare or crime or some policy issue that matters, you're sometimes going to tell a story about your engagement with the government or what happened to you. But the stories have a point. And that's the difference between public speaking and policy speaking.
But the point is usually hasty generalization.
Well,
here's an instance, here's a datum.
But in an extended discussion where people actually open up to each other, then they understand the implications and the limitations of their stories. And the public turns out, I mean, in China we've been doing this, and 7% of the sample was illiterate, and now there's a town in China that's making its whole budget with deliberative polling. And the people who were less educated participated just like anybody else. But they also became more informed because they picked it up in the discussions. So in that sense, the views of the ordinary people make a lot of sense. And in the Chinese case, the party officials thought the people would want big, fancy image projects. What do the people want? Sewage treatment plants and clean water. And once they heard it and understood it, they thought, this makes a lot of sense, and they did it.
So I want to cue off of that in an unfair way, because I want to pick up on China, but not in the example you've been using. Because, Jane, I know that you, if I understand, are in favor of using deliberative techniques even in authoritarian regimes, which may be not really, it's a show deliberation, perhaps. Am I I'm sure.
If it were totally a show deliberation, obviously I wouldn't be for it. But an authoritarian regime, let's just take China, because that's where Jim and I just came back from, might think of moving forward with deliberative polls, has moved forward. China has moved forward in certain township, in this particular township, with deliberative polls, because they control the agenda. It's only consultative. It's not really threatening. So why should I be for it? Because in China, a lot of Chinese tradition and so forth, because a lot of rural people are illiterate, many of the elites feel disdain for the peasants. The very word peasant, or the word masses, but particularly the word peasant, has almost got a little disdain built into it. And those elites don't think that citizens can make very good decisions. When you have a deliberative poll and you find that they do make good decisions, that's a big learning experience. And you've seen it in the way the bureaucrats of this township that now makes some of its major decisions by deliberative poll, you see the difference in the bureaucrats. And you see certain other little moves, like Jim can tell you, that they've made the budget public for the first time. The whole township budget public. These are small moves that authoritarian regimes normally don't do. So I think that deliberative polls are a way of a country that's not used to democracy educating itself about the capacities of its citizenry, and also beginning to experiment with greater openness in ways that are not so frightening for the regime. Now you could say, well, the fact that it's not frightening for the regime makes it useless, but it's not just show. They have taken those recommendations, and each time they take the recommendation, it makes it a little harder next time not to take the recommendation.
Can I just introduce one fact?
One fact, and I want to ask both of you a question.
Yeah. So when Jenny was invited to a conference she and I were both part of a conference which was mentioned in The Economist a couple weeks ago, at the Central Party School in Beijing, which is sort of the nerve center of Chinese governance. It's not just, so this town in China has become very famous, particularly on the internet. So the very top decision makers in China convened this conference to think about how far could deliberative polling go in China. And they're very interested in going forward. So it's not just, a little town here or there. This could, once the Central Party School, the very fact that we were inside the Central Party School, Jenny, was in fact remarkable. And that in the inner sanctum, because the head of the Central Party School becomes the next president of China. Hu Jintao was the head of the Central Party School. It's at the very top of the Chinese leadership structure. So they're very seriously considering how to implement deliberative polling in a scientific way, in a scientific and balanced way. And so it has real prospects in China done properly. And yes, it's not about elections, it's about policy. Nevertheless, it creates an expectation that government policy should be responsive to the representative and informed views of the citizenry. And I think other democratic systems should aspire to that same criterion.
Okay, so I want to ask one last moderator question and turn to the audience. And this is for all three of you. Jane, towards the beginning, you said that we were irreversibly, and I think it was going down a path of polarization.
Absolutely.
Jim, you said, if I may quote, the net can solve the problems of democracy. Can the net solve the problems of democracy? Is it like Homer and alcohol, both the cause and solution to all life's problems? So this is very close to Brendan Greeley's question to the prior. Are you an internet optimist or pessimist? I'm a disappointed optimist. I'll put that out.
Look, we have shown.
So does it?
Go ahead.
Let's start. Let's actually go across. If it's irreversible, yikes.
One path is irreversible, and I'm calling on us all to figure out how to make the other path faster. In other words, if you've got, for example, when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law in 1964, he said, we've lost the South for a generation. He was right about losing the South. He was wrong about a generation. The South was lost. What's happened is you've had a major realignment. The American parties sort of make sense in a way they didn't when the Port Huron statement, the Students for Democratic Society were saying, the trouble with America is we don't have parties that stand for anything. Well, now we have parties that stand for something, but they're not talking to each other very much. And that's one source of polarization, that the South is now acting much more conservative. It used to be part of the Democratic Party. And another is TV and ads and money. TV's huge in American campaigns. Ads are huge. How do you get ads? You got to get money. How do you get money? You got to get funders. Where do the funders come from? They come from the more extreme parts of the party. So that's also going to happen. We have lost the South. The Democrats have lost the South. That TV stuff is not going to stop. So what? And then the other thing, I mentioned before, everybody's moving to more like-minded districts, talking to only one another, and the internet too. So what do? Give up? No, you try harder to bring diverse voices together. And really, I think it is the job of everybody in this room to use our brains to figure out how to do that. We've got one way to do it, but that's not going to be the only way. America Speaks has got these big, big forums. They're not at all representative, but they do bring people together, sometimes 4,000 people together to talk about issues in a more moderated way, a way that gets the different sides in. But those are still, in my view, kind of drops in the bucket. We absolutely have to exercise our ingenuity, our technological expertise to figure out, okay, how do we use the internet to bring diversity together? How do we use the moderators? You just gave an example. All right, the Future's in front of us. There's a big, big stream of cars going in the polarization direction. Got to have something else in the other direction.
Howard?
Well, I am often accused of being an optimist, which I actually am not. I'm not going to argue with Jane about the irreversible polarization, because I don't think I can make a great argument for it. However, if you think about it, and you're not an optimist, then nihilism is really not a very sustainable, personally, it's not a very sustainable point of view. If you're a good nihilist, you don't live for very long. You die on behalf of your cause. So I choose to be hopeful, and I'm optimistic about that choice, because I think we are all the descendants of humans and organisms who have thought there must be some way out of this irreversible mess that we're in. So I would frame the question somewhat differently, and I think it's not just semantics. I would say, in what ways might we or must we attempt to use the internet to solve some of the real problems in American democracy? And you talked about our bias towards deliberation. I think that's a constitutional bias. I think that was a decision made by the founders. I think it was the mistrust of the mob, that we don't want to have democracy because we're going to have a plebiscite and run off and invade our neighbors every day. We need to elect some people to represent us, to deliberate, and I think that we wouldn't get much disagreement to the statement that there doesn't seem to be a lot of deliberation left in that process. So that's why we're trying to think of how might we use the internet to engage the population so that it's not a mob. And I think deliberation means widespread participation, but not in an unthinking, herd-like manner.
I think I agree with what's been said. Look, we're living with the dark side of freedom. The liberties that we value so much have the dark side that self-selection can lead to a dialogue among the like-minded, which can lead to extremism, as Sunstein showed. The progressives gave us new form of public consultation. I live in California with special elections all the time. I see the ways in which that dream has turned sour, and we get populism and things that would not have surprised Madison, who relied upon deliberation, but by representatives, as in Federalist 10, where they were supposed to refine and enlarge the public views. What Madison didn't know, which we have discovered in our empirical work, is that the people can deliberate. You don't have to be an elite to deliberate. The people are very competent. We have shown empirically, and we have the advantage over Madison in terms of all democracy is institutional design. He had to make up a political science that would justify having rule by somebody other than a king. Their indirect republic, the indirect republic that he devised, we have social science, and we can show that the public is very smart. And we have a possibility proof that the public is not only smart, but quite responsible if we can only figure out how to spread and make impactful the deliberations of the people, representative versions of the people. And so I only have a partial solution. I'm sure it's not the only solution, but it's something constructive. And there are ways, I'm sure there will be ways, as technology changes, to spread this on the internet and also to spread it in the schools. We have even did a controlled experiment in a school in Menlo Park where we found that deliberation was much more effective for civic education than conventional civic education. Suppose schools...
So we want to open up the question.
Yeah. So there might be ways of spreading it. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Excellent. Okay, questions? Oh, over there. Who might you be, young man?
Yeah, hi. Is this mic on? Hello?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Try it now? Okay, it's on. So, hi.
Please say who you are.
Micha Sifri.
Thank you.
So my question is whether, what evidence we have for the idea that the powers that be actually care what the general public thinks. And or is it possible that voting, which started out as self-determination, is now just a sort of game we go through to legitimize whoever actually wins the game to do whatever they want to do for the people who actually have power?
Beth Novick still here, by the way?
Is Beth Novak still here? I don't know. But it's a sort of serious question, which is, I mean, because you're talking about, you know, taking a badly broken tool, which is voting and you know, representative democracy, and updating it with like a really great, you know, like let's graft this way of deliberating in. But your assumption is that the powers that be actually want to listen, and maybe they mainly want us just to legitimize them and think that we have had a say, as opposed to really give us a say.
So, Mika, I was not joking. If Beth were here, I would have posed the question to her, since she's in the White House and
But she's in the part of the White House that doesn't actually have that much power.
Okay,
She's in the
so-
good part of the White House.
Can I respond to
course.
that?
And then I'll do Paul.
So yes, you're right. Politicians want to get reelected. However, if they have hard problems, they want cover. So when we solved this budget crisis in Rome that's described in my book, all the alternatives were bad, and the assessore told me we gave him cover to do the right thing. Partly because the media took it seriously, and the Italian media took it quite seriously.
Close hospital beds.
Yeah, that's right. But the point is, in a lot of places, we made some progress in Brazil and in Argentina along the same lines. When there's a hard problem, no matter what they do, something bad is going to happen. Then there's a reason to pay attention. That's why deliberative polling is countercyclical. So that's the first thing. Okay. Secondly, when there are unexpected possibilities. I mean, I never would have thought of a regulatory context like the Texas story, which led Texas going from last to first in wind power, described in my book. So I never would have thought of that. And the public utility officials were very surprised. I mean, Pat Wood was a George Bush appointee, the head of the Public Utility Commission, who ended up carrying the ball because he was convinced it turned out the people were the best lobbyists. The people convened a scientific sample of the people to deliberate about these energy choices. So there are possibilities. Everybody's not completely cynical, but they are cynical enough that, of course, you're mostly right, but you're just not right enough that there are openings to set an example for how to bring the people in a representative and thoughtful way into the policy process. So you have to pick your bets carefully in order to develop this.
Okay.
Jane, did you want to reply?
Yeah, and I'd add two things to that. Obviously, this is not a panacea. It's I think I described it before. It's a drop in the bucket, but it's, you know, the bucket fills up by drop by drop. So there are two things. One is sometimes politicians commit to these things. In Texas, the utilities commissioner committed to it ahead of time. Well, you know, if you've committed to it ahead of time, it's not good if you go back on it. Secondly, the audience for this is not just politicians. It's the people. So one of Jim's early ideas, which I would love to see put in practice, would be to have a deliberative poll before any primary. So you got to see what citizens who got to see the candidates' materials and got to talk to the candidates and what citizens thought in a deliberative way rather than whatever primary it was. And that there would be no effect of that except what the American public took in. So the audience there is not the politicians, it's the public. Now, if you say, well, the public doesn't have any power, then it's not going to do very much good. But to the degree that the public does.
Right, and I'm not making it that black and white. They're great answers.
Yes,
Yeah, so,
And, who are you?
oh, sorry, my name's Evan Hutchison. I just graduated Kennedy School, where Jane teaches. So I had just two things. In response to Professor Manbridge and what she said about this, you know, irreversible course that's kind of broadcast media driven and the money that gets involved and everything. I would make an argument that those are like conventional forces. Those are aircraft carriers and really expensive radar systems, whereas SMS, especially outside of the proprietary context and these other modes that actually don't necessitate necessarily internet connections, those are the IEDs. Essentially, I think of the way to derail that polarization and that these asymmetries are being closed very quickly. So with that, my other question is, Athens was the government, right? This participatory process was compelling because actual policy was made at the end of the day. It wasn't just, as Mikro was talking about, an overlay to a pretty corrupt status quo, which I think is what happens a lot of times. So my supposition would be the only way this would be sustainable, New York City's got the community boards, which are funded through the borough presidents, which gets actually tens of millions of dollars a year to just create this kind of very non-participatory consultative body. Now, if you could get the people in with the IEDs to support these openings, you could actually have it become part of governance, at least on the local level, abolish the community boards, use that funding that was there to create some sort of deliberative, participatory, randomized, process that then had binding government decisions. And my supposition is that people would care quite deeply if the decisions being made were actually policy.
All right, so great. In interest of time, let's get very quick reactions to this. You can see the clock, so.
I agree with your second point completely. As for the first one, whether these new technologies will go in the different direction from the convoy of the old technologies, that time will tell. But our experience with the internet has been rather niche creating. It has been segmenting. It has been people like-minded talking with one another, or else talking against one another, but in a highly explosive, non-deliberatory, not really listening. This is a panel about listening, not in a listening way. So find a technology that really gets people to listen to the other side, and I'll give it some money out of my own pocket, I'll tell you.
Well, I wouldn't want to let the very practical suggestion here be lost in the grander arguments that the city of New York has money to spend, and
Absolutely.
there are people who have opinions about how that money is spent, and it's at a scale which is both large enough that if it was to work in some way would gather a lot of attention, but I think it's at a scale that's small enough to be manageable. If anybody can manage New York at all, you can manage the process you're talking about here. And I recall what John Perry Barlow said about the renaissance of the city-state. So maybe if we stop thinking about how are we going to deal with this wreck of American politics and start dealing with how do we deal with the wreck of large city politics, then something at a possible scale might be done.
So solve the scale problem by reducing the scale of the entity that's interacting with the. Yes, and I'm sorry, this will be the last comment.
Okay, so yeah, face-to-face deliberative polls are not so expensive because you don't have in a locality. But let me just say, reflecting on what you said about how certain kinds of interest groups might find an interest in supporting something like this, that Texas example, years later, it took me years to find out, how did it come to be that there was a requirement that the electric utilities in Texas had to consult the public? Once there was that requirement, they turned to my process because hundreds of millions, so much was at stake, and they knew they might get noise from polls, and it was lucky. It was a lucky shot we were able to do it. But the point is, I talked to some people at Public Citizen and at the Environmental Defense Fund, and they said, this was no accident. We worked for years to try to bring in a requirement that the public be consulted. And once there was a requirement that the public be consulted, there were a lot of logical reasons why it should be consulted in a representative and informed way about such a complex set of issues. That was the opening. And they were so delighted. The Environmental Defense Fund had laudatory press releases with the companies involved the same day. They'd never gotten results like that in terms of renewable energy any other way. So by indirectly pressing for public consultation done well, they got their policy aims. I didn't even know it, but that's how it worked out.
So we are out of time, so thank you very much, Jim Fishkin, Jane Mansbridge, Howard Reingold, and thank you very much.